The approaching spring of 1942 promised to bring new great difficulties. As long as the ice crossing was kept, the connection with the 330th Rifle Regiment, which was defending the Nevsky Patch, was reliable and help could always be rendered to it. But how will it be when the Neva opens up and ice flows, especially ice flows from Ladoga, float along it faster and faster? A powerful ice drift will cut off the regiment from the right bank for several days. Only he who has seen with his own eyes the Ladoga ice on the upper Neva knows what it is. What is the strength and power of this loosened bogatia? During the ice drift, with the negligible amount of shells that the artillery had, it was impossible to provide the 330th Rifle Regiment with active fire support from the right bank. The division's control and firepower were bifurcated and dispersed on a wide front along the right bank of the Neva from Poroga to Nevskaya Dubrovka. The 284th Rifle Regiment was temporarily disbanded in December 1941. The division was subordinated to another regiment under the same number, which stood guard on the ice road of life across Lake Ladoga. In February and March 1942, the division, using battalions of the 169th Rifle Regiment, defending the right bank, in order to reveal the enemy's fire and defence system, conducted a reconnaissance by combat across the Neva River at the paper mill and the area adjacent to the blown-up railway bridge near the village of Kuzminki. The set task was not completely fulfilled, but nevertheless the reconnaissance gave a lot to clarify the system of fire and defence of the Nazis. The March reconnaissance search was conducted on very unreliable ice, and soon came the day, which we had been anxiously waiting for all this time. The Neva had opened up, and its powerful ice floated swiftly across the river's breadth. With a ringing and rumbling sound, they cut off all communication between the banks. The ice was stronger than Hitler's fire. Since of the ice route, remnants of camps on the ice and other links of the forever glorified road of life floated past the patch of Lake Ladoga, but we were no longer interested in spectacles and reflections. More than a month, the 330th Infantry Regiment steadfastly withstood fierce attacks of Hitlerites, occupying the section of the Nevsky Patch, which used to be defended by two divisions. The regiment occupied the defence along the front of 3.8 kilometres. We had 94 men per 1 kilometre of the front. The fascists had no less than 1,000 active bayonets. In the morning of April 24, 1942, when the ice of the Neva River was in motion, the columns of earth raised by ruptures, logs of broken dugouts rose above the patch. A sand cloud covered the horizon. Fierce Hitlerite attacks began in order to destroy the defenders of the bridgehead. Telephone communication of the division headquarters with the 330th Rifle Regiment was cut off, but the observation from the right bank and the testimony of the first wounded, who had time to evacuate with the greatest difficulty, still allowed to reproduce the picture of what was happening there. The regiment commander, Major Sergei Alexeyevich Blokan, who was wounded in the neck at the very beginning of the battle, remained in the line and controlled the units on the right flank. The Hitlerites bombarded the heroes of the heel with aviation and fired a lot of guns and mortars. The infantry of the enemy, conducting an attack from several directions, dismembered our forces, as a result of which the left flank of the heel was quickly cut off. The enemy cut into its location and came to the riverbank in the area of one of the crossings. With the 330th Rifle Regiment, fought a separate detachment of the division under the command of Captain Fyodor Nosov. The brave officer died during the counterattack. This counterattack was not the only one. The defenders of the heel, despite heavy losses from air bombing and artillery and mortar fire of the enemy, fought with great persistence, defended in separate ducks and bunkers. Everyone who was on the right bank of the Neva River rushed to the aid of the 330th Infantry Regiment. There were a lot of volunteers, but the crossing to the patch was severely hampered not only by the mighty ice drift, but also by the fact that the enemy's artillery and mortar fire destroyed most of the boats. The 1st Rifle Battalion of the 284th Rifle Regiment rushed to the rescue.
This regiment, after the opening of Lake Ladoga, was redeployed to the Dubrovka area. In the first boat to the bridgehead crossed the commander of the Rifle Battalion. At the same time, a group of officers of the 86th Rifle Division moved to the bridgehead. Senior Battalion Commissar Shurov with political workers Eremiev and Peremievsky, Chief of Staff of the Division Major Kozlov, Chief of the Operational Department Major Gusev with his assistant Lieutenant Gulte, Gusev was wounded on the right bank at the crossing. The rest had time to cross the Neva.
The management of the evacuation of the wounded from the left bank and the organization of the crossing was entrusted to the Commissar of the division headquarters, Senior Battalion Commissar Seradian, and all this hot time was non-stop at the fourth crossing. By the end of the second day of the battle on the bridgehead, there were no watercraft left at all. During 3 days and nights, the heroes of the beachhead did everything that was in their power. It was a fight not for life, but for death. No one left the battlefield. The wounded were on their positions. On April 26 in the morning, Hitlerites even more intensified artillery and mortar fire. The ground was burning. The shells and mines destroyed trenches and passages. The fascists, believing that they destroyed all defenders of the patch, went in full height to it. The surviving heroes met them with accurate fire. Bravely fought fighters led by the Commissar of the Rifle Battalion M.I. Pevsner. Nearby fighters fought under the command of the regiment commander Major C. Blokin, now wounded in both legs. The Nazis attacked the area of the command post of the 330th Rifle Regiment. They were met by a group of fighters under the command of the Chief of Staff of the 86th Infantry Division, Major Yar Kozlov, which included the Commissar of the regiment's senior political officer Alexei Vasilievich Krasikov, the Chief of Staff of the regiment Major Alexander Mikhailovich Sokolov, his assistant Senior Lieutenant Kukushkin, Commanders Grinblatt and Kuzmin. More than 12 times supported by powerful artillery fire, using flamethrowers which burned all living things, Hitlerites rushed to attack a handful of the bravest of the brave, and each time rolled back with heavy losses. By the end of April 27, 1942, the last radiogram came to the headquarters of the 86th Infantry Division. It said, "As one soldiers and commanders to the last drop of blood will beat the enemy. The site will be taken only through our corpses. Kozlov, Blokin, Sokolov, Krasikov." The fascists intensified their attacks, brought fresh forces into the battle. The defense of the 330th Rifle Regiment was cut. In several places, the fascists reached the Neva River. The head of the political department of the division, Battalion Commissar A. Shirov, and the chief of staff of the division, Major Y. D. Kozlov, leading the defense in the area of the command post of the regiment, during one of the counterattacks were mortally wounded and died on the patch. Heroically met death soldiers, commanders and political workers. At the fighting post, drawing the soldiers to the attack, the regiment commissar, senior political officer Alexei Vasilievich Krasikov died a death of the brave. From the right bank there were still visible some small pockets of resistance. Bleeding, badly wounded heroes fought with fascists for several days. Thus ended the 7-month fighting on the heel. Only for 3 days, from April 25 to April 27, 1942, the defenders of the Neva bridgehead killed more than 1,500 soldiers and officers of the enemy, put out of action 8 observation posts, 4 bunkers, 8 mortars, 1 gun blew up the ammunition cellar. At the end of April 27, 1942, Major A. Sokolov, the regiment's chief of staff, who had been wounded 3 times, swam across the river. 3 times wounded man in the ice drift, under enemy fire, swam across the Neva. What kind of fortitude must he have? When nowadays retired Colonel Alexander Mikhailovich Sokolov is asked to tell about this event, he gathers his thoughts for a long time, and only he alone knows how difficult it is to go back to the fiery past. The night was bright, he says, sparingly dropping words and in colour. The fascists had arranged illumination. Of course they found out, started shelling. I had to dive every now and then. Once I dived, at the end of breath, I rushed to the surface and hit the back of my head on the ice. It would have taken a few more seconds, but it was already the edge of the ice floe. I surfaced, turned over on my back. I couldn't feel my left leg. There was no left leg. I swam on my arms and went on swimming. I didn't know how much time had passed. Once again I hit my head. It was no longer ice, but a raft moored to the shore. I climbed out on the logs and lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, it turned out that I was frozen to the logs, lying as if spread out. I managed to tear myself away and crawled away from the river. The legendary 330th Rifle Regiment fought on the bridgehead to the last cartridge, to the last survivor. I write about the last days of the defense of the Nevsky Patch, the exploits of my fellow soldiers based on the stories of eyewitnesses. So, by the decision of the Military Council of the Leningrad Front in late February 1942, I was appointed first deputy commander of the 42nd Army, but I think that the story of courage and fortitude of the soldiers of the 86th Infantry Division would be incomplete without these final lines. Already in 1943, after the capture of the 8th Gres and the territory of the former Nevsky Patch, when our front line approached the village of Arbuzovo, officers of the headquarters of the 86th Infantry Division visited the broken dugouts and bunkers in the depth of the defense of the patch. Everywhere were visible signs of persistent fighting, most of the wooden fortifications burned. They carefully examined all the former structures, accidentally dug an old trench. In it opened a picture worthy of imprinting on a bas-relief in memory of the defenders of Leningrad who died here.
Among our soldiers covered with sand, one of them, probably from the former sailors, was without a uniform, in a single tunic with a rifle, bayoneted into the corpse of a Hitlerite soldier, and a few steps away from them lay a Hitlerite with a machine gun, apparently shooting at our unknown hero. All of them were covered by one shell during the last attack of fascists on the heel.
The Soviet people piously honors the bright memory of the heroic defenders of the city of Lenin. In the places where the 330th Infantry Regiment of the 86th Infantry Division met the fascist beast, and in fierce fighting stopped it, monuments were erected to immortalize the exploits of the soldiers of the regiment. Robert Rojdestensky's heartfelt poems carved on the monument Rubashny stone are dedicated to
You,
the living, you, that from this land we didn't want to leave, and we did not. We stood to the death. By the dark Neva River, we died, so that you might live. In the last days of March 1942, in a shabby MKA of the 5th Frontier Troops, I arrived at the 42nd Army CP, which was located in the basement of a multi-story building near the meat packing plant. The duty officer took me to the office of the Chief of Army Staff, Colonel G.K. Perkovitz. We got acquainted, talked. Listening to the Chief of Staff, I immediately sympathized with him. I thought that it would be good to work with this calm and balanced commander who can catch new things in the life of troops. Together with Colonel Bukovitz, I went to introduce myself to the commander of the 42nd Lieutenant Ivan Fedorovich Nikolaev. The slender, trim general came up to meet us and smiled welcomingly. Hello, Andrei Matveevich. We are looking forward to seeing you. We need you very much. At that time, a short, broad-shouldered corps commissar, unhurried in his movements, entered the office. It was Nikolai Nikolaevich Klementiev, a member of the Military Council of the Army. The commander said that I had to immediately deal with the issues of checking the organization of the duty service at the front line and run-in tanks personnel. Then the general went to the maps spread out on the table with the situation on it. The front line of the 42nd Army's formations had its right flanked northwest of Ligovo Station and was bordering the Gulf of Finland. Then it went north of Uritsk, along the northern outskirts of Staropanovo, the southern outskirts of Verkhoyrovo, Pulkovsky hiked up to the railroad bed Leningrad, Pushkin. Then began the defense strip of the neighbor on the left, the 55th Army. Here Hitlerites stood at the gates of the city of Lenin. The enemy had excellent observation points in Pishmash, Uritsk on the Raven Mountain. The fascists viewed not only the main strip of our defense, but also the whole depth of the army defense. Hitlerites kept one of the largest factories of our country, Kirovsky, and the main fairway of sea communication, Leningrad, Kronstadt on direct gunfire. The enemy had a full opportunity to allow himself to choose an object, a target.
Conducting systematic targeted destructive fire, the fascists did not consider that in front of them was a city of many millions, having cultural values which are dear not only to the Soviet people, but also to all progressive men.
To Leningrad, the fascists brought powerful long-range artillery, including the heaviest guns from all the captured countries of Europe. There were Su-140 M railway cannon Rheinmetall, firing at 3645 kilometers. The Sokri de Farsin 20 M mortar, which hit with 800-kilogram shells. 400 mm railway French howitzer, the weight of the shell was 900 kilograms. 305 mm mortar Skoda M16, 220 mm mortar Schneider, 210 mm cannon Skoda, and many other powerful long-range gun. The characteristic feature of enemy artillery operations near Leningrad was that from the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942, it began to be divided into two parts. The first part was the ordinary army artillery. It included guns ranging from 75 mm cannons to 210 mm mortars, which had relatively short ranges. This artillery was located near the front line and provided defense for German troops. The second part of the German artillery consisted of more powerful guns from 150 mm cannons to 450 mm mortars. This was the so-called siege artillery. It was located in the depth of the defense and had a special task: to destroy the city, destroy its population, and affect communications. Surround the city in a tight ring by shelling it with artillery of all calibers and continuous bombing from the air to raze it to the ground. Tenterping tells, if any requests for surrender are made, they will be rejected, because the problems connected with the stay of the population in the city and its food supply cannot and must not be solved by us. In this war waged for the right to exist, we are not interested in preserving at least part of the population. These excerpts from the directive of the Mad Führer to his troops once again convince us of the cannibalistic nature of fascism. In the fall and winter of the first year of the war, Hitlerites repeatedly made attempts to break into the city of Lenin, but all their attacks were repulsed. The stability of the defense in the area of Pulkovo Heights, the key of the defense of Leningrad, greatly contributed to the active offensive actions of the troops of the Leningrad front in the area of Nevskaya Dubrovka. Successful combat actions of our troops, near Tikhvin and on the Volkhov frontiers, were links of a single defensive operation of the Soviet troops. The Military Council of the Front demanded from each army to continue to improve the equipment of two strips, the main and the second, which is 3-5 kilometers away from the main one, to prepare cut-off positions in especially important directions. Where now there are high-rise ornate houses in the neighborhoods of Leningrad, the army defense strip was drowned in swamps, above which the Pulkovo Heights lay a blistering hill. They stood out sharply in comparison with the low and swampy places of the main defense strip. Closer to the right flank of the army strip, perpendicular to it, was the railroad embankment of the Baltic Railway, and on the left flank, near the junction with the 55th Army, was the railroad bed Leningrad, Pushkin. Even farther back, in the areas of Rogatka and Myasokombinat, a high railway embankment ran parallel to the frontage of the main defense line of the army. In September 1941, the troops of the Leningrad Front, divisions of the People's Militia, and sailors of the Baltic Fleet stopped the selected Hitler's troops that were rushing to the city of Lenin. Directly behind the army strip followed the defensive lines of the inner defense of the city. They consisted of an outer strip and urban sectors. The outer strip of the inner defense of the city was divided into 4 districts: southern, eastern, northern, and western. The outer strip was equipped in the field way, that is, in the form of battalion areas prepared for filling them with field troops. The inner urban defense sectors were a system of strongholds, including urban buildings and factory areas prepared for circular defense. In the points of probable landing of enemy paratroopers, and they were considered the largest city squares, as well as the outskirts of the city, machine gun points were installed and round-the-clock surveillance was conducted. Defense lines crossed the entire city. On its squares stood powerful pillboxes, and in the bricked windows of houses gaping embrasures. The city was constantly on the alert, ready to take the fight to its streets and fight for every house, every floor. Acting First Deputy Commander of the 42nd Army, I spent a lot of time on issues of maintaining high combat readiness of the 1st Echelon troops, occupying the main line of defense, especially the personnel of the first position, strongholds and defense nodes. With commanders of all levels worked out the interaction of fire and maneuver, the organization of observation service, field training, and further improvement of defensive structures. We put a lot of work into the training of personnel in tanks. The army began to receive large quantities of armored turrets removed from unfinished battleships and cruisers, turrets from KB tanks, and individual armored plates. We began to reinforce the field structures of the main and second line of defense of the army with bots, bunkers, reinforced with armor plates. Bot and Zot cut into the railroad embankments, especially in the area of Rogatka, significantly strengthening the approaches to the city. In the fall of 1941, the troops and the population did a tremendous job of building defensive structures. On the southern and northern bypasses by the beginning of 1942, there were about 82 km of anti-tank ditches, almost 25 km of escarpments and counter-escarpments, about 9 km of embankment, 144 km of wire barriers, more than 24 km of barricades, 1,400 armoured, reinforced concrete and wooden earthen fire points. In winter, the city could not allocate enough people for the construction of military engineering structures, and in the army, units weakened from malnutrition fighters were less engaged in heavy defensive work. The bony hand of hunger stretched over the civilians and defenders of the city of Lenin. Since November 20, 1941, 250 grams of bread per day were issued on work cards and 125 grams on other cards. On the front line, a soldier was given 500 grams a day, and in rear units, 300 grams. In December, the stock of cereals and vegetables ran out. This was the usual menu of those days. Breakfast, flour soup; lunch, the same soup or flour porridge; dinner, again flour soup. In the units, especially in those that were in the second echelon, many soldiers, like the townspeople, were sick with elementary dystrophy exhaustion. On December 1, 1941, in the troops of the Leningrad front, operating in the blockaded territory, were sick with a severe form of dystrophy 6,061 people. On January 1, 1942, the number of patients increased to 12,604, and on February 1, to 13,719. For 3 months, the units lost more than 11,000 commanders and ordinary soldiers, that is, in fact, a full division. Since February 1942, the number of patients with dystrophy began to gradually decrease, and by the summer there were almost no cases. In the words of the old workers of the Kirov factory became winged in the city. "We will eat stones, but we will not give up Leningrad." By their heroic example, Leningraders tell us, there is no higher cause, no nobler duty than to give all the power of the mind, all the flame of the soul, all of themselves without a trace to the motherland, wrote on February 12, 1942, the frontline newspaper on guard of the motherland. During this period, the party and Komsomol organizations were tasked to educate the fighters' unshakable faith in the rightness of our cause, and victory over the enemy, high steadfastness in defense and constant combat readiness. The Military Council of the Front demanded from the political organizations to conduct their work in such a way that our people were constantly striving to enter into battle with the enemy, and this should not be an isolated phenomenon, but a headquarters and political department of the 42nd Army put a lot of effort to organize a broad sniper movement. Soon it became mass and effective in all units. I often remember one episode. At the firing position lined up mortar calculation, political officer of the company, round-faced lieutenant, firmly shaking hands with a fighter excited by the attention of all. Announces Private Petrovich Gavrilov, performing a combat task to defend the city of Lenin, being on a combat hunt, today killed a fascist beast. According to Russian custom, let us bow to Private Ivan Petrovich from the motherland and from ourselves. By killing the fascist beast, he saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, the lives of our mothers, fathers, wives and children, brought closer the hour of our victory. Needless to say how exciting such congratulations became for the snipers. Soviet patriotism and fierce hatred of Hitlerites, who tried to strangle Leningrad in the ring of blockade, became the main reasons for the birth of the sniper movement in the troops of the front. The future hero of the Soviet Union sniper of the Leningrad front, Sergeant Vladimir Nikolaevich Pachalintsev, told in his book. Leningraders suffered from cold and hunger. They were bombed, they had no water, no light. And these days I received a small parcel from Leningrad, in which a caring child's hand, among other things, was laid bagel. Many years have passed, but every time I remember the front, this bagel comes to my memory. At such moments before my eyes I see a thin, hungry blue from the cold Leningrad boy, who with thin, transparent fingers put this bagel in the parcel to Uncle Soldier, to eat a bagel and beat the fascists harder. No, now I am not surprised that I could lie in the bitter cold for days, tracking down fascist scum who tried to take away our children's happy childhood. Often on my way to hunting, I would meet my many friends. Hunting, one of them would ask, and you could feel the camaraderie of envy in their voice. Don't forget to clap one for me too, because I'm on duty today. In the winter of 1940 and 1942, snipers became the most prominent people of the army and the front, and their movement, thanks to wide propaganda, care of commanders and political workers, truly mass. The army newspaper on the defeat of the enemy did a lot for the roll call of snipers, during which they revealed the secrets of their skill. Letters of famous Hitlerite fighters were read and reread by the fighters, burning with the desire to open their revenge account. patriotic movement of snipers was promoted by their meetings in regiments, divisions, armies. During the army meeting of snipers, I had a chance to get acquainted with many of them. Here is Alexander Kalinin, round, kind Russian face, clear blue eyes. His military uniform fits him baggy, and you would not think that in front of you a formidable sniper and brave scout. For the first 6 months of the war, Kalinin killed 115 fascists, 20 times crossed the front line. About 107 days he spent behind enemy lines. With great interest I listened to the speech of Sergeant Vladimir Nikolaevich Pichelyenz. He told me that even before the war, especially during his studies at the geophysical faculty of the Mining Institute, he was fond of shooting sports. Therefore, having enlisted as a volunteer in the Red Army, he asked for a sniper rifle. Komsomolets Pichelyenzev opened his combat account on September 8, 1941, and by the day of the jamboree he had already destroyed about 150 Hitlerites. When the 11th Rifle Brigade organized a sniper school, the command put Sergeant Pichelyenzev at its head. And Pichelyenzev. Students of the famous sniper studied the theory in the rear and practiced on the front line together with the teacher destroying Hitlerites. Pichelyenzev told about his duels with 14 fascist snipers and finished his speech with his favorite saying, "The Russian bogatier once hits, but aptly puts." Day by day, the combat account of the former Arkhangelsk woodcutter and hunter Euphrator Ivan Veshlivtsev and his comrade Pyotr Kolychenkov grew. For 2 months, they killed more than 250 enemy soldiers and officers. And hundreds of ultrametric shooters not only exterminated Hitlerites themselves, but also taught their skill to their comrades. Of course, not every sniper's bullet killed the enemy. The main thing is that there was an aimed fire all along the front line. Every bullet, every shell the soldiers tried to send to the target, to the enemy, and soon the fascists learned it well. Our fighters taught them to crawl, drove them into the trenches. On February 6, 1942, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR awarded the high title of Hero of the Soviet Union to 10 best of the best snipers fighters. Here are their names. Petty Officer I.D. Veshlivtsev, Red Army Man P.I., Kolychenkov, Deputy Political Officer A.A., Kalinin, Lieutenant N.A., Kozlov, Senior Sergeant S.P., Loskutov, Sergeant V., N. Pechelintsev, Senior Lieutenant F.F. Sishkenyevin, Red Army A. Smolyachkov, Lieutenant F.O. Fefnin, Junior Lieutenant M.I. Yakovlev. 130 best snipers of the Leningrad Front were awarded orders and medals. On February 22, 1942, speaking at the frontal meeting of snipers fighters, A. Zhdanov called them true heroes of the Great Patriotic War and set the task for commanders, commissars, political commissars and party organizations to make the sniper movement. Every day the results of the sniper movement became more and more tangible. A captured Hitlerite showed. Russians shoot devilishly well, all hits, in the head, between the eyes, in the neck. On quiet days Russian snipers knocked out 6-10 men from our company. In the diary of the killed Nazi lieutenant, the following record was made. The main losses of our battalion are from artillery fire and from the fire of Russian snipers, which greatly complicate the work of sappers. For 4 months, our company lost 119 men from their fire. The combat glory of Leningrad snipers is not forgotten even nowadays. Anyone who has a chance to visit the State Museum of Leningrad history will undoubtedly notice among its exhibits this one. A rifle to which is attached a metal plate with the inscription, "To the Sniper Fighter I," Dobrik from a member of the Military Council of the Leningrad Front A. Zhdanov, February 22, 1942. By that time, the brave sniper destroyed 300 Hitlerites. The hero lives in his native village Kudlai, which is in Nemirovsky district of Vinnytsia region. After the war, he worked as a carpenter in the collective farm, took an active part in the restoration of public economy. Now Ivan Timofeyevich is retired, but the veteran does not sit idly by. He can often be seen in the circle of students of the village school. The veteran helps to bring them up as fiery patriots of the motherland. In June 1942, there was a relative calm near Leningrad. Active fighting was going on far from the city, on the Volkhov frontiers and in the Demyansk area, where the Volkhov and Northwestern fronts were constraining the large forces of Army Group North. Supreme Command approved the proposal of the Military Council of the Front to strike at the Emgin-Sinyavinsk grouping of the enemy, where our troops were separated from the Volkhov front troops by a relatively narrow. Counterstrikes from the east and west. It was planned to ram the enemy defences and clear the southern shore of Lake Ladoga from the enemy, that is, to do what our troops could not achieve in the fall of 1941. Along with the task of breaking the blockade, it was meant to disrupt the preparation of the Nazis for a new assault on the city. The main burden in the upcoming battles fell on the troops of the Volkhov Front. Marshal of the Soviet Union K. The heroic troops of the Leningrad Front were exhausted by the harsh living conditions and weakened by the long defense. They were not able to take on a large task, and the Stavka tried to facilitate their participation in the operation. The troops of the Leningrad Front were to actively restrain the opposing enemy forces located in the Schlisselburg Neck, to assist the Volkhov Front with artillery and aviation. It was decided to conduct a private operation with limited objectives on the right flank of the 42nd Army and in the defence strip of the 55th Army.
I was invited by the commander of the 42nd Army, Lieutenant General E. Nikolaev, and informed that a directive had been received from the front headquarters, in which a combat task was set. On July 21, 1942, the 42nd Army, using parts of the 109th and 85th Infantry Divisions, supported by the Army's artillery, having taken the initial position for the offensive on the right flank of the Army in the area of Ligovo, by a sudden attack seized the fascist strongholds of Staro Panovo and Uritsk.
Carrying out this operation, and command of the group of troops on the right flank of the 42nd Army to entrust the Deputy Commander of the Army, Major General M. Andreev. I should note that the front headquarters fully supported the idea of the operation, in the development of which I was actively involved, and it was pleasing. All of us, both soldiers and commanders who had learned in the heavy fighting for the city of Lenin the bitterness of failure, hunger and cold, wanted to strike a tangible blow to the enemy, to feel the joy of victory. On the night of July 21–2, 1942, units and parts of the 109th and 85th Infantry Divisions, making up the first echelon of the operational group of the 42nd Army, began to move to the starting line using the lines of communication and trenches, with the task of 2 hours before the attack of the first echelon to take the initial position, the first trench of the main line of defence of the Army. Exactly at the appointed time hit the enemy division of Guards reactive mortars. A few seconds after the salvo in Uritsk, with a strong rumble and a fiery and blinding glare, rocket shells began to burst one after another. The houses in the village shook like in a fever. Its streets were engulfed in a sea of fire. The mad Hitler's soldiers and officers were panic-stricken, rushing through the trenches and between the burning buildings. Simultaneously with the Katyusha salvo, the attached and supporting artillery made a fire raid, and our first echelons went on the offensive. Rifle chains captured the first, and then the second trench of the fascists. The left flank broke into the enemy's stronghold, Staro Panovo, and on the outskirts of the village Uritsk. It took 20–30 minutes for Hitlerites to come to their senses and started to resist our attacking units. During the day they made more than 10 unsuccessful counterattacks. Our troops, having seized Staropanov and the northeastern outskirts of Uritsk, firmly held the captured lines. Slowly dusk came. The fight flared up, then on one, then on the other flank. Hitlerites could not accept the loss of the stronghold of Staropanovo and the outskirts of Uritsk, and did everything to knock us out of there. By the middle of the night, after clarification of the situation, it became clear that our units had suffered significant losses. Many commanders were out of action. Artillerymen accompanying the infantrymen suffered heavy losses. Scouts reported that the Nazis are hastily pulling up tanks and infantry from other areas. All this said that in the morning of July 23rd, the enemy would make a strong counterattack. Having evaluated the situation and the position of our units, the headquarters of our group of troops took all measures to strengthen control and communication. We strengthened the anti-tank defense with several guns of divisional artillery regiments. All night sappers installed anti-tank and anti-personnel minefields. The expected in the morning fire attack and tank counterattack of the enemy should have been answered by a preemptive strike of aviation, tanks and concentrated artillery fire. We did not have aviation and tanks. We did not have a powerful artillery support. Conclusions from the assessment of the situation and the situation of our troops I reported to the Army Commander, Lieutenant General I.F. Nikolaev. I asked to retain the initiative to further strengthen the group of troops with one more connection. But apparently the situation did not allow to do this. There was, I think, an underestimation of the Hitler's command used the night for pulling up reserves, especially tanks, and by fire strikes and counterattacks of available forces during the night made it difficult for our troops to consolidate the occupied lines. In the morning of July 23, 1942, there were bomber airstrikes on Staropanov and the northeastern outskirts of Yuritsk, artillery and mortar fire. Having tanks in front, the fascists attacked our units from two directions. The superiority of the enemy in personnel, and especially in tanks and aircraft, was absolute. Despite the absolute superiority of the enemy in fire and striking power, his first attack was repulsed. We managed to hold the main lines. Extremely effective fire support was provided by fearless artillerymen of the Baltic sailors. Powerful and accurate fire strikes of the ship's artillery were decisive in repulsing the first attack of the Nazis. Not looking at the strong fire of the enemy, the sappers, despising death, installed new anti-tank and anti-personnel minefields. Exceptional fearlessness and heroism were shown by infantrymen, artillerymen, sailors. Hitlerites conducted with the greatest tension and density of aviation and artillery preparation. They rained tons of bombs and shells on our units, which in Staropanovo and Yuritsk managed to dig only intermittent and not full-profile trenches, and by the middle of the day, having conducted a repeated attack of tanks and infantry, cut into our fighting order in the center of the village of Yuritsk and in the area of Staropanovo, crushed the left flank units. In Yuritsk and further on the right flank to the Gulf of Finland, our units continued to fight for every house foundation and every crater. During the second assault, the fascists managed to squeeze our units. Separate platoons, calculations, despite the strong fire and tank strikes of the enemy, remained at their positions, continuing to fight surrounded, cut off from their battalions and regiments. At the command and observation post of the task force in the area southeast of Ligovo Station, the chief of staff and the artillery commander of the group were seriously wounded. I was also wounded, but continued to lead the battle. The day was already drawing to a close, but the battle was not dying out. It was expanding along the front and especially in depth. In the village of Yuritsk, engulfed in flames, there was heavy firing. In the fire rifle and machine gun and mortar battle entered the units that covered and rigidly defended the main front edge of the main defense strip of the army. The battle unfolded in depth from the previously occupied initial position to the advance of our units, to the boundary of our greatest advance into the depth of the enemy's defense. By evening, the information from units and parts came contradictory. To clarify them was more and more difficult. Most of the command posts were smashed by enemy bombs and shells. Many commanders were wounded, and some were killed. By the morning of July 25, 1942, our divisions and units were ordered to withdraw to their original starting lines. Stiff actions of the troops of the blockaded Leningrad were a kind of test of offensive abilities of divisions and regiments, their preparation before the decisive battles, which were soon to unfold. In these battles, the Nazis suffered heavy losses in manpower and equipment. At the end of October 1942, I was summoned to Moscow, where I received an unexpected, but very flattering for me, offer to head the formation in the far east of a compound of border guard soldiers, the frontier troops, to which I was sent on a Komsomol ticket in 1924, have always remained close and deep. I started my military service in the Smolensk regiment of the OGPU. From here I was sent to the frontier. I passed in a cap with a green trim on steps of different posts on outposts in NKVD troops. In 1939 he graduated from the Franz Military Academy and, as the reader already knows, was appointed head of the 5th Frontier Sestroretsk Red Banner Detachment. I was looking forward to a new meeting with border guards, believing that I would find among them reliable combat comrades who would not let me down during the most difficult trials. It seemed that the train was unbearably long at the stations packed with echelons. Platforms with cannons, tanks, and other equipment covered with tarpaulins were coming to the front in a continuous stream. Concentrated faces of soldiers and commanders looked out of the teplushki. By the will of the party, our entire country turned into a single giant military camp, the harsh, confident life of which testified to the imminent turning point. In Khabarovsk, I was met by Major General Anatoly Nikiforov, head of the Far Eastern District Border Troops. He told me about the selection of command and political personnel for the new compound, about many unresolved issues. So far, the regiments lacked artillerymen, communications specialists in the engineer sapper service. by order of the General Staff, should be allocated to us from the troops of the Far Eastern Front. Front Commander Army General I.R.A. General I. Apanasenko, to whom I introduced myself immediately after the meeting with Nikiforov, received me not very welcoming. After learning with what purpose I arrived and where I had previously fought, Joseph Rodionovich, with undisguised bitterness, expressed about the failures of our troops at Leningrad. For what only reward you there? Me sliding a glance at the 3 orders of the red banner on my jacket, he said unhappily. I knew well that the glorious hero of the Civil War, former chief of the 1st Cavalry, is raring to go to the front. All his thoughts where there are fierce battles with the Nazis. His irritation is also understandable, and still he considered it necessary to object. To say that at the front it happens that some people get their orders taken away for old merits. All right, don't take offense, General, said Apanasenko, standing up from behind the massive carved table. Shrugging his mighty shoulders, he walked leisurely along the carpeted path to the office door. Opening it, he ordered the adjutant to serve us tea. Then, sitting opposite me in a chair that creaked pitifully, Iosif Rodionovich asked about the situation on the Leningrad front for a long time, and it was felt that he was looking for answers to the questions that had long given him no peace. Finally, pushing aside the empty glass, he said, I know why you've come. Ask for whatever you want for your border division. We'll give you the best men. Nothing is spared for the front. The life of the new unit took me over without a trace. Far Eastern Rifle Division of the NKVD troops was composed of soldiers and commanders of Khabarovsk and partly Primorsky border districts. There was no shortage of volunteers to go to the front, as they say. We received hundreds of letters from border guard soldiers with only one request. I want to go to the front line. I want to beat the enemy. The unit was formed according to the wartime staff of the People's Commissariat of Defense and was named Far Eastern Rifle Division of the NKVD Troop. At the head of the division and its regiments were put experienced commanders and political workers. Colonel Konstantin Vasilievich Ovchinnikov became the head of the political department. Colonel Kuzma Evdokimovich Grebenik was appointed deputy commander of the division, and Colonel Daniil Vasilievich Kazovich became the chief of staff. Both commanders, participants of battles with Japanese samurai, on such companions could be relied on in everything. For the new division, no one spared nothing. From the Far Eastern warehouses, soldiers and commanders received good white fur coats, felt boots, a full set of light small arms. We were to receive heavy weapons later, when we relocated to the Perm region, where units and regiments intensively engaged in combat training. The final tactical exercises with live firing were attended by an authoritative commission from the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs and the General Staff. Kherson, the division is combat-ready, ready to join the active army. Yan, said the general who headed it. We only need to sign the appropriate act. No, not ready. I was forced to object to the chairman of the commission. We have absolutely no transportation, neither automobile nor carriage. How can artillery regiments, medical unit, general army commanders do without it? The remark is reasonable, agreed the chairman of the commission, making a note in his notebook. Part of the vehicles will be received before shipment, and the rest will be provided at the stations of the echelons. Indeed, a few days later we began to arrive herds of low horses, which at that time were called Mongols. They met the division's transportation needs by 10 to 15%. We never received the promised vehicles or artillery tractors. We realized that there was a difficult situation at the fronts. The order was received to urgently load into the given echelons and go on the road. In these days at Stalingrad, the offensive of our troops began, as a result of which 330,000 grouping of Hitler's troops got into the ring of encirclement. The gigantic battle on the Volga continued until February 2, 1943. On February 5, 1943, by the order of the Supreme Command Headquarters, our division was included in the Red Army, receiving the final name 102nd Far Eastern Rifle Division. The division arrived in Yelets, and by order of the commander of the Central Front, Colonel General K.K. Rokossovsky from February 15 was included in the 70th Army, formed from the troops of the NKVD-US. From here, from the ancient Russian town of Yelets, our unit began its combat route to the west. We received a combat order to immediately move out and concentrate southeast of the town of Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky. We had to make a forced march of more than 200 kilometers. We remember the continuous blizzard, roadlessness, Snowdrifts were so great that only rifle units could move. Soldiers and commanders carried ammunition, mortars, shells, regimental guns, and even separate guns of the divisional artillery. In addition, the march was made through the territory, only recently liberated from the enemy, burned and looted. This created additional difficulties. Local inhabitants willingly gave us sledges, and often together with our soldiers jumped into them, helped to transport ammunition from village to village. The population of the liberated villages lovingly welcomed the division units, accommodated them for rest in their dugouts, helped the sick and frostbitten. This mental care and frontier hardening of soldiers was stronger than the hardships of nature. The 102nd Far Eastern Infantry Division, having made a forced march in the most difficult conditions, reached Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky. The newly created Central Front, which included the 70th Army, was assigned the task to deploy northwest of Kursk in readiness to launch an offensive at Sevskaya and Donetsk on February 15. However, by this time, the troops of the front failed to reach the areas of concentration. The offensive began only on February 25. The 70th Army provided the offensive of the 65th and 2nd Tank Armies from the direction of Orel, having turned its front to the north. By the end of the day, on March 7, together with the advanced units of the 30th Rifle Regiment, I entered Bryancevo, where the headquarters of the 69th Rifle Division was located, whose units we were to replace. I was taken to a snow-covered hut to the commander of this unit. I was met by a slender, medium-sized colonel whose face seemed familiar to me. Slicked-back blonde hair, large features, blue eyes, mischievous smile. Bah, this is my old acquaintance, Ivan Alexandrovich Kuzovkov, with whom we studied together at the Higher Frontier School, and then at the Frunze Academy. We embraced. Andrei Matveevich, I'm waiting for you like a god. Replace my thinning troops in Ploskoy and Kuchelevna as soon as possible. Ivan Alexandrovich, I have an army, but the men haven't eaten for 24 hours. The rear has fallen behind. If you can, help. Colonel Kuzovkov ordered to feed the personnel of the 102nd Division from his reserves. After dinner, Kuzovkov laid out on a roughly chipped table map with a map of the situation. Tomorrow morning we were to attack, and the enemy, his defense we have studied so far only on the map. A few hours later, the units of the 30th and 16th Regiments replaced the 120th and 303rd Regiments of the 69th Rifle Division. The first echelons of the 30th Kazan Rifle Regiment of Colonel Vasily Ivanovich Matronin and the 16th Ussurisk Rifle Regiment of Colonel Ivan Mikhailovich Pavlovich on the night of March 7-8, 1943, without air and artillery support, were ordered to attack the enemy defending on a previously prepared line. The approaches to the enemy defense line were crossed by a stream with a deep, swampy floodplain. Hitlerites had time to well equip their positions. They had a widely branched network of trenches with machine gun points and bunkers, wire barriers and minefields. But the blow of our units was swift and unexpected for the fascists. The enemy opened a strong barrage of mortar and artillery fire, conducted several counterattacks. They also managed to repel them. Despite the desperate resistance of the Nazis, the soldiers of the 30th Rifle Kazan Regiment confidently developed the offensive on the shoulders of the repulsed fascist units, moved forward and occupied the most favorable positions. The success was achieved. It was necessary to develop and consolidate it. Meanwhile, the enemy pulled up reserves, intensified fire, his aviation bombed, and for several days the fascists counterattacked the units of the Kasansky and Ussuriski regiment. However, where the border guards from the Far East stood, the Nazis did not pass. Kasansky and Ussuriski steadfastly kept the captured frontiers. By this time it became obvious. The element of surprise was lost. The enemy continued to pull up their reserves. Consequently, without providing divisions with ammunition, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and without cooperation with neighbors to continue the offensive is impossible. The command decided to stop the offensive, set the task to firmly hold the occupied lines, to strengthen the defense in depth, to turn the occupied positions into an insurmountable fortress. The March battle served us as a severe school, in which the soldiers and commanders acquired the first bits of invaluable experience of war. These battles showed the insufficiency of our skill in conducting combat operations in difficult conditions. Commanders of units and units were not always at the top when organizing interaction on tasks, boundaries and time with regular and attached means of reinforcement. Commanders had only just learned how to place, move, put into battle, and fire support of second echelons, battalions, and regiments. Turns he who knows the enemy, he wins. There was no need to talk about this truth to the border guards. They knew it all very well. Soldiers, sergeants, platoon, and company commanders showed excellent observation, eyesight, speed, and accuracy of orientation, especially in the night battle. In short, they demonstrated a high combat school of border service. But this could not be said with regard to the headquarters, units, and formations. Intelligence data was processed slowly, analyses and conclusions were made superficial. Mutual information and interaction between units and headquarters of branches and neighbours were poorly organised. Headquarters needed more cohesion. Regimental commanders still had little reliance on their headquarters and did not work much with them. How important it is to start the first field battle well. The first victory inspires, creates an incentive for further offensive. For us, the February-March battles of the division were hard. The advanced units of the 102nd Far Eastern Rifle Division did everything they could. So personnel of the compound did not lose the presence of mind, showed exceptional endurance. So began the combat history of the 102nd Far Eastern Infantry Division. History is made by people. The history of our division is the history of courage, selflessness, high political maturity, shown by the border guards of the Far East in the battles with the Nazi invaders. During the battles on the outskirts of the town of Dimitrov-Skolovsky, a group of soldiers of the 40th AMA Rifle Regiment advanced far ahead and were surrounded by the Nazis. Later, when the division occupied this area, it turned out that the frontier guards fought with the vastly superior forces of the Nazis literally to the last, killed more than 30 fascists. The whole group perished. In the pocket of the gymnoskeleton of Private Elisiv, they found a note written with a chemical pencil. The letters floated up somewhere, but we managed to read it. Here's what he wrote. Dear comrades, I'm going into battle as a communist, and I swear I won't disgrace this high rank, and if I die in battle, consider me a communist. Dear comrades, if I die for the motherland, then inform my parents that their son fought honestly with the enemy. To the address Kursk, Region Bidorsky District, Village Konyaevo, Death the other side of the leafless. Death to the German invaders. Believe, comrades, victory will be ours. Long live our heroic Red Army. Goodbye. With a fiery greeting, Elisiv. The note was transferred to the political department of the division. It is still kept in the archives. In accordance with the combat order of the 70th Army Headquarters, our division moved to the defense on the outskirts of the town of Dimitrov-Skolovsky along the line of Bryancevo, Ferezovo, Halzevo, Muravchik, on the left flank of the 70th Army, the northern front of the Kursk Bulge. To the left defended the compounds of the 65th Army. Combat order of the division, 2 echelons. In the first echelon on the right flank of the defense took the 40th Amur Rifle Regiment, commanded by Colonel Markian Pogrebnik. Before his arrival in the compound, he was deputy chief of the 63rd Border Detachment. On the left flank, the 30th Rifle Kazan Regiment, commanded by Colonel Matronin. In the second echelon took the defense of the 16th Ushuraisk Rifle Regiment, commanded by Colonel Pavlovich. The width of the regiment's defense areas, their depth and means of reinforcement were determined by the peculiarities of each direction, tank danger and operational expediency of the army defense. The main forces of the division were concentrated on the section of the 40th Amur Rifle Regiment. One of the characteristic features of the defense of the regimental sections and the entire defense strip of the division was deep echelon, the creation of anti-tank strongholds and nodes, a widely branched and deeply cut into the ground trench system, the presence of cut-off positions and communication lines along the front and in depth. Regimental sections and the entire defense strip of the division were created primarily as anti-tank, with the expectation of repulsing the strikes of large tank units of the enemy. Company battalion in any conditions could even in complete isolation to conduct a long, intense battle. All positions were reliably defended from the front, flanks and rear, supported by the fire of divisional and army artillery, which maneuvered the trajectory of fire, were able to provide a massive defeat of targets in any area in front of the border of the defense line and in its depth. At the same time, the division units repeatedly fought to improve the outline of the front line, quite often repelled strong enemy attacks. Fighters, commanders, calculations, units, staff, without wasting time, performing defense tasks, studied directly on the front line, honed combat, personal field training, training of the calculation, squad, platoon and company. The second echelons of battalions, regiments and divisions directly on their lines polished combat operations as part of a unit with means of reinforcement. Later, during the offensive, our fighters and commanders were convinced by their own experience that the one who received good field training in defense masterfully owns his weapons. The laws of field combat. No enemy is not afraid. During the defense, we paid due attention to the placement, education and replenishment of commanders and political workers. I remember returning from a trip to the 30th Rifle Kasan Regiment. The head of the political department, Colonel Ovchinnikov, said, "Matronin does a good dude. Personally takes care of the rapid replacement of out-of-service commanders, political workers, party leaders and Komsorg, so they polistave a notebook," he added. "Only lately 26 junior commanders, 17 specialists, 5 platoon commanders, 2 company commanders have been appointed. We need to prompt other regimental commanders not to wait for personnel from the outside, to raise them themselves." I remembered this conversation later when I signed the submission for the award of the title Hero of the Soviet Union, Captain A.F. Soloviev. F. Soloviev. He was one of the 2 company commanders whom Colonel Matronin promoted to higher positions. Anatoly Fedorovich Soloviev skillfully and competently commanded a rifle company in the battles for Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky, Novgorod-Seversky, Gomel, and then grew into an excellent, known for the fighting skills of the entire division commander of a rifle battalion. During the period of defense, we learned well to conduct reconnaissance searches, intensified the actions of snipers. Undoubtedly, in the success of these types of combat operations in the division played a major positive role in the training that our fighters and commanders received during service on the border. It was the peculiarities of the border surface. To walk silently, to camouflage, to listen sensitively to the sounds coming from the enemy, to understand and decipher their nature, etc. That helped us in defense. Border guards in their mass were able to shoot accurately. It served as a basis for the development of snipers' movement. Masters of marksmanship of our division kept Hitlerites in constant tension. Probably. That's why the first hero of the Soviet Union in the connection became Sniper Ivan Vasilievich Vazherkin. Vazherkin's combat biography is typical for the fighters of the 102nd Rifle Division. Born in the Ryazan region, he was drafted into the army in 1938 and until November 1942 stood guard over the far eastern borders of our motherland. At the end of 1942, Sergeant Vazherkin became a squad commander of one of the units of the 30th Kasan Regiment. He became a sniper in the very early period of fighting, when the division tried to stabilize the line of defense, chose for this purpose the most advantageous lines, repulsing them from the Germans. Behind the back of the squad commander, Sergeant Vazherkin, then was an ordinary Russian rifle of the 1890 Anathi model. But even at the outpost, Vazherkin learned to shoot perfectly. He knew the 3-line rifle to the last screw. Once moving forward, his squad was stopped by enemy fire. Vazherkin hid his men in a crater. The Germans took the border guards under targeted fire. Then the squad commander Vazherkin secretly crawled out of the funnel, began to observe. The sergeant quickly understood the situation, found a snow blockage, from behind which 2 Hitler's soldiers were firing with automatic rifles. Vazherkin put a cartridge in the chamber. Someone of our Red Army soldiers squawked in the funnel, and the Nazi immediately came out from behind the cover and opened fire. Vazherkin immediately destroyed him, and the second machine gunner. Having congratulated the famous sniper with another success, I advised him to speak in the division newspaper with a story about his experience of destroying Hitlerites with the first shot. Soon such material was printed. "I have a passion for accurate shooting," wrote Vazherkin. "I became more observant, searched out and killed the Nazis where they used the most cunning disguise." Sniper movement in the period of defense became a mass movement in the parts of the division. Sergeant Vazherkin had a lot to do with it. He did a lot, bringing up young snipers. Petty Officer I. Kudrashov, who opened his combat account as Vazherkin's partner, became a famous sniper of the regiment. Such snipers as Poshkin, Shirin, Pachin were also well known in the division. All of them were also Vazherkin's pupils. During the long defense at Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky, Vazherkin worked tirelessly. He chose and prepared his positions usually at night, and he did not limit himself to one position, but made, as a rule, 3 positions. One, the main one, was torn off in height and carefully camouflaged. The second one was made a reserve one, and the third one was a false one. One of the main positions served him for quite a long time. He was improving it all the time, and once he found a machine gun shield on the battlefield, dug it into the berm of a trench, camouflaged it, made a small embrasure and fired only through it. It should not be thought that only our snipers acted on the front line. In the army of Hitler's Germany, there were also many snipers who inflicted losses on us. Sergeant Vazirkin had many dangerous fights with enemy snipers, and his comrades in arms always waited with excitement for the outcome of this fight. Ivan Vazirkin had so annoyed the Germans that they already knew about his existence and set the task to their sniper, called from a special school, to destroy the border guard. Sergeant Vazirkin quickly realized this and began to act more cautiously. For 3 days, Sergeant Vazirkin hunted for the German sniper and could not spot him. On the 4th day, it was pouring rain. The weather was not sniper. However, Vazirkin went to the firing line and his comrades sat in the dugout and waited. Could he really do anything in such weather? They could not believe it. Already after lunch, some kind of fuss began behind the cloak tent, with which the entrance to the dugout was covered. At last, Vazirkin appeared. He was all wet and so covered with mud that he was hardly recognized. "Well," the fighters asked in one voice. The sniper stepped to the stove, took the German automatic rifle off his shoulder and threw it on the floor. "Yeah, he just said. The machine gunner was killed." "And the sniper?" asked the soldiers. "First him, and an hour later the machine gunner. He was covering his sniper then. He was alone. I didn't let him go." It was difficult for Vazirkin to accomplish this task alone. Then he left his partner, Petty Officer Kudryashov, at the main position and moved to the reserve position, which was much to the left. Kudryashov behaved cautiously, but still let the German know about himself. He waited for a long time. Apparently he decided to be sure of the presence of our sniper and to act only for sure. Finally he fired a shot. That's when Vazirkin noticed him. The Hitlerovite, it turns out, had equipped his position on an absolutely flat place, where one would never think of it. The wreckage of the carriage of a light cannon was burrowed into the ground to the right of it. It seemed to him that it was there, behind this debris, that the German sniper had settled down, but it turned out that he had burrowed into the ground to the left, and there was nothing in front of him but a crumpled German helmet pressed into the ground. There was no bottom in it, and the German was firing through the hole in the helmet as through an embrasure. It was almost impossible to see any fire or smoke after the shot. But when Vazirkin began to follow him from the reserve position, from the flank, he saw this traitorous smoke and froze. He had to wait for a long time, but not in vain. The fascist slightly raised himself and cautiously, barely perceptible movement, raised his rifle, began to aim. His helmet, camouflaged, was the same color as the ground, only slightly yellowed part of his face, which Vazirkin saw almost in profile. The sergeant's shot was flawless. The machine gunner, who was covering his sniper, apparently did not realize where the bullet had been sent from, sat for a long time in cover, not daring to show himself. Vazirkin thought that he would lie down until dark, but the enemy soldier was impatient. He decided to crawl away. That's when Vazirkin killed him, and then he crawled to the cover and took his machine gun. I wanted to crawl to the position of the German sniper to take his rifle, but decided not to risk. It was very difficult to get to him through the open terrain. And in the Hitlerites' trenches, they already understood the meaning of their sniper's silence and kept his position under the crosshairs. Snipers were of great help during offensives. It often happened like this. Lieutenant Rybov, the company commander, called Vazirkin to him, unfolded the map and showed the right place. "Me prepare your position, and at dawn, at the signal of the attack, destroy here the calculation of the German machine gun." In the defense stood for a long time. All the terrain was studied sniper Vazirkin most thoroughly, so he quickly oriented himself and clearly carried out the task. Many times Vazirkin had to fight with the enemy tanks and self-propelled vehicles advancing on our positions. He hit the observation slits, and if it was possible, knocked out the enemy machine gunners from the armor of combat vehicles, very effectively helped our infantry to move forward. Not once Vazirkin had to infiltrate in advance with a small group of fighters in the rear of the Germans, and with the beginning of the battle, specially hunt for Nazi officers, decapitate enemy units. How many Hitlerites the brave sniper Vazirkin killed? Now it is difficult to say, but in the division newspaper I found a figure of 148. Gradually, a peculiar Vazhirkin school of snipers was formed in the division. I have already told about many snipers, his followers. I would like to name Ivan Gusev Nikolai Bayarkin, about whom I have written many times both in the division and army newspapers. Subsequently, a sniper platoon was created at the division headquarters, commanded by Vazhirkin. Ivan Vazhirkin distinguished himself not only in the sniper field, he was also known as a brave scout, initiative commander. By the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on January 15, 1944, Sergeant Vazhirkin IV was the first among the soldiers and commanders of the 102nd Infantry Division to be awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The name of Ivan Vazhirkin, a frontier hero, the son of Ryazan collective farmers, an old Russian soldier, a participant of the First World War and the Civil War, Vasily Panfilovich Vazhirkin, and a hard worker, Pelagia Alexeyevna Vazhirkina, who was repeatedly elected a deputy of the village council, adorns the first pages of the combat history of the 102nd Infantry Division. Already somewhere before the end of the war, Sergeant Vazhirkin was sent to officer courses. Intelligence is commonly referred to as the eyes and ears of the commander. This phrase has become familiar, maybe some people are tired of it, but we use it again. It very accurately expresses the essence of the purpose for which the scouts are searching. When there is no good accurate data about the enemy, the commander, his staff of course, become if not completely blind, then at least poorly seen. Junior Sergeant Peter Florovich Petrov, who served in the border troops for more than 3 years, was an outstanding scout. It is clear that one does not become a master of search at once. The group went without sufficient preparation, without studying the area where it was supposed to take the tongue, without knowledge of the enemy's defense system, and failed. I remember such a case. A search group from the reconnaissance company of the division went out at night to search. The soldiers at the front line talked to the commander of the rifle unit, learned something from him, and moved forward. The capture group outlined the target, got up, rushed to the trench where the Hitler was sitting. There were 30 meters to the trench, and suddenly the fleeing scouts jumped on something elastic. Some invisible force threw them back on the ground. They fell, there was a ringing noise. Nobody understood anything. Hitlerites opened indiscriminate shooting, the group, and not without losses. What is the matter? There was nothing mysterious in this failure. They went without proper preparation, and though they demined the area, crawled close to the trench and rushed forward amicably, but because of the darkness they did not see the tight as a string-stretched wire, jumped on it and fell. On the wire were hung tin cans, all sorts of iron. They rang. The Germans opened fire. That's the whole secret of failure. And if we had watched, crawled beforehand in front of the Hitlerites' front line, we would have seen the wire, and it was not difficult to make the necessary passages in it. Junior Sergeant Petrov many times went in search of the senior group, and never once with him happened a mishap similar to the one described above. Only in the defense at Dmitrovsko-Lovskoy he hunted for the tongue at least 30 times. About the capture of his first tongue, which the group took in early March, he told me after his return, "We carefully studied the enemy in the search area, made passages in minefields, raised the wire where necessary. The Germans had no solid defense in that place, and at night a sentry was walking along the wire jumping from the cold. They decided to capture him. The search went without any special adventures. The German was grabbed from behind, gagged, and quickly tied the trophy with a rope. It was a bit difficult to drag the Hitlerite. He turned out to be a real heavyweight. They put him on a cloak tent, passed the rope under his bound hands, and dragged him, as on a sledge, through the snow. At first the prisoner behaved relatively calmly, but when he was pulled under the raised wire, he suddenly began to thrash and got caught in the wire. The Germans discovered the group, opened fire, and wounded the tongue. Goods that easily, or else the search would have been lost. As you know, the importance of reconnaissance is sharply increased before the offensives. The commander needs to know exactly the forces and means of the enemy, the construction of the defense, its reserves, etc. When at the end of July 102nd Rifle was preparing to attack at the Kursk Bulge, on my order Petrov went out to search with a small group. He already knew the enemy's front line like the back of his hand. The first and second line of German trenches scouts passed unnoticed. They moved to the rear, carefully camouflaged in the shrubs. From their hiding place, the scouts saw the trenches and dugouts of the Germans. One of these dugouts attracted their attention. It was entered mostly by officers. Probably there is the headquarters of some unit, suggested Petrov, when it was already getting dark. Several officers accompanied by soldiers came out of the dugout and left. Near the dugout, everything became quiet. Two Hitlerites, one, judging by the epaulettes, an officer, the second soldier, remained at the dugout. The soldier took out some neat boxes and put them near the path that led to the rear. Then the Nazis were talking about something. I got the impression that they were going somewhere. What if the Nazis are preparing to evacuate? Dusk had not yet thickened when the scouts decided to act. They were worried that the Germans were about to leave this dugout. After all, it was not in vain that they put some boxes near the path. When the Nazis entered the dugout, Petrov, quietly like a shadow, moved towards it. Comrades remained in place as part of the support group. The scout entered the dugout. There were 3 Germans. The soldier was fiddling at the door, and at first, not realizing what was going on, looked at Petrov with bewilderment, even asked him something. The scout took out the Hitlerite with a dagger and shot the second one with a machine gun. With the remaining one, the conversation was short. The senior sergeant put a gag in his mouth, tied his hands, and looked around. This was clearly a headquarters dugout. On the table was a briefcase and a typewriter. The scout looked into the briefcase. There were some documents. He took them together with the typewriter. At that time, the telephone began to buzz. Petrov cut the wire and took the machine with him. He showed the Hitlerite with the muzzle of the machine gun to the exit. He went without resistance. Maybe he still hoped to meet his own. But where was there? Petrov's comrades picked him up at once. The scouts returned without losses. Language turned out to be very valuable. He was Peter Florovich Petrov had many awards. But the first of the scouts of the division, I gave him the Order of the Red Banner. Looking ahead, I want to tell you how I had a chance to meet with Senior Sergeant Petrov once again in the deep fall of 1943 on the right bank of the Soj River, south of Gomel. The scouts had just returned from a search which could not be called successful. Despite the fact that it was already cold and the mercury had dropped to 0, or maybe even lower, Petrov was dressed lightly, or rather so neatly that it seemed light. His head was tied with a piece of camouflage trophy cloak tent, and he, tall, slender, looked like a Bedouin or a Caucasian mountaineer. Well, I addressed him, "Is everything all right?" Petrov asked permission to smoke. Having received permission, he took a greedy drag and threw it away uncertainly. "Anything happens, Comrade General." His scouts came up, quietly talking about the search that had just ended. It turns out that the group brought the tongue but lost 2 fighters. That's why Petrov answered like that. True, he was not distinguished by great talkativeness. But we never managed to see each other again. The division fought hard and unsuccessful battles for the village with the loud name of Stenka Razin, and not even so much for the village. It was almost non-existent, but for our land. A group of scouts led by Senior Sergeant Petrov soon left again to search. This time, the communist Petrov was seriously wounded in the stomach. He died in the medical center, where his comrades took him. He was buried not far from the village of Kuti, on the left bank of the Soch River. Talking about the scouts of the division, I can't help but remember the communist petty officer Daniil Fedorovich Natoptam from the 30th Kazan Regiment. Before serving in the 102nd Division, he had been on the border since 1939. His comrades in reconnaissance, Komsomol Sergeant Ivan Nikolaevich Yoborin, Sergeant Nikolai Fedotovich Lazarev, and Komsomol Sergeant Veniamin Filipovich Roshnev were also like him. All of them at one time served on the border in the same 75th Border Guard detachment. Friendship, which began on the border, became even stronger in hot fights with Hitlerites, and in what only troubles were not scouts, but always came out of them with honor. On the night of June 2, 1943, the regiment commander sent a group under the command of Petty Officer Natoptanago in an ambush. At about 1 a.m., the scouts suddenly saw several enemy infantrymen. The Germans were walking quietly to the right of Natoptanago, and into the scouts followed them closely. Hitler's soldiers approached our minefield in the gully, sat there almost until dawn. It was difficult to understand what they were doing, but the scouts had the following impression. They just sat there without doing anything. After Hitlerites left Natoptani got to the place where they were, he found nothing suspicious there, except for a forgotten mine detector. Having returned to the location of the unit, Natoptani reported to the command about his observations. It was decided to send the group to the same position again at night and to mine the mine detector. And so they did. When it got dark, the fighters from Natoptania's group stealthily went to the yesterday's place, positioned themselves on both sides of the German mine detector, and began to wait. Hit light everything was repeaters. Hit Lee right his detentures and again went along the gully to the mine detector. They came up, sat down there, and sat for a long time, chatting quietly. Then one of them decided to take the mine detector. There was an explosion. At the same time, from the flanks opened fire from machine gunners from the group of Stomped. Hitlerites in panic rushed away. Oberyn and Roshnov took 2 of the fleeing prisoners. In addition, the fascists left several corpses and a severely wounded officer near the mine detector. He too was taken away by the scouts. When the offensive began, Natoptani's group acted in a mounted formation. Once behind Novorad-Seversky, mounted scouts passed about 15 kilometers. The enemy was not found. On the road along the forest, they advanced to the nearest village. The roofs of the houses, of which could be seen from behind the trees. T cavalrymen dismounted, hid the horses away from the road, leaving Private Valko with them. To the village, they made their way through a gully, moving along its edge, overgrown with small bushes. When they reached the vegetable gardens, they crawled between the rows to the barn of the outermost house. When they reached the barn, Stompy looked out into the street and saw this picture. Opposite across the street near the house, a small group of fascists had settled down. One of them sat on a bench near the gate and knitted a bundle of straw, then put it on a pole. They were preparing to set fire to the village. 2 or 3 enemy soldiers were standing and joking. They had a fun job ahead of them. They were laughing carelessly. Suddenly one of the Germans quickly went to the house, behind the barn of which the scouts were lying. The Hitlerovity ran into the yard and entered the house. She quickly to the porch, ordered Sergeant Lezachev and Oberyn, "Let's capture the German." Lezachev and Oberyn came close to the house, stood behind the corners. The Nazi came out and they rushed to him, but the Nazi managed to fall behind the porch and opened fire. The firing started. Then the rest of the scouts rushed into the village. Sergeant Lezachev pinned that fascist, who fell behind the porch and made a noise, to the ground. The Hitlerite was taken alive. So mounted scouts, saved from destruction of the big village, took the tongue. During the defense at Dmitrovsk-Orlovskoye, I more than once had to be a witness of glorious fighting deeds of girls who in our division served in different positions. They had a hard time in the war, but here is what is remarkable. As a rule, all of them were looking for any opportunity to get to the front line, to take a personal part in battles with the enemy, and when they succeeded, they showed courage and bravery in battles. I remember how one day I unwittingly witnessed a conversation between Tamara Zirianova, a sanitary instructor, and the commander of a reconnaissance company. Sorry, Captain, take me to the reconnaissance. You, she begged. You, Tamara, will not go anywhere. Nitrosapation cut off with annoyance. The girl continued to argue that she needed to be there to help the wounded, but the captain was inexorable, and yet Tamara got the permission of the commander to go with the scouts. The girl, in an abandoned cell not far from the wire fences, organized a sanitary post. The fight of our scouts with Hitlerites was cruel. From a fascist trench grenade explosions, screams of fascists were heard. More than 20 Hitlerites found a grave in this skirmish. During ways of departure of our reconnaissance, fascists opened artillery and mortar fire, and fire sultans of burst sword where Zirianova took refuge. But the girl did not leave her post. She looked until her eyes hurt in the direction from which the scouts were to crawl. The first to appear was the wounded Red Army soldier Andreev. Tamara grabbed him firmly by the shoulders and dragged him to the cell. Bandages were placed on the fighter's wounds. Under enemy fire, Tamar also helped Sergeant Krasenkov and Junior Lieutenant Nemtsov. Zirianova noticed how slowly crawled under enemy fire, severely wounded Senior Sergeant Tyapin, and rushed to meet him, although it seemed impossible to raise his head under a hail of shrapnel. The girls stopped the bleeding, bandaged the wounds. The scout's life was saved. This is how Tamara Zirianova, a loyal daughter of the motherland, acted in battle and was soon awarded the Medal for Bravery. And here is another episode from the life of military medics. At the command post of the Rifle Battalion, commanded by Captain Nikolai Mikhailev, have long been accustomed to the monotonous dialogue between the commander and military medical officer Masha. The commander of the Rifle Battalion, Captain Nikolai Mikhailev, ordered the paramedic Maria Levaikina to immediately leave the combat order of the advancing unit and return to the forward medical aid station. The military paramedic tried to object. Why return? I want to help the wounded here. The next time you appear here, you will be penalized. Levikina waved her hand with annoyance and went back to the empty trenches. Suddenly, the military field officer heard a long groan. The girl stopped and looked around. Wounded. Climbing the berm, she looked around the recent battlefield. A wounded soldier lay on the blackened snow, behind shreds of barbed wire. Not far from him, enemy shells were still bursting. Voin Feldscher crawled forward. Look, the nurse is crawling into the minefield. The soldiers passing along the trench got excited. Get back, get back, shouted to her from the trench. But the girl continued to crawl. Suddenly her hand, bogged down in the mossy snow, came across something metallic, a mine. Looking around, she saw a field covered with snow bumps. There were a lot of them. The wounded man noticed a bag with a red cross on the girl's back and called out in a weak voice. Mädchen, sister, sister. Now, comrade, be patient. Levikina shouted to him and, trying not to think about mines, crawled forward. The wounded man lay just in the middle of the minefield. During the attack, he apparently stepped aside from the made passage and blew up on a mine. The fighter's leg was shattered. Masha deftly, habitual movements cut his pant leg. Banjo grabbed the neck, but do not push, she said to the wounded and crawled carefully back. The girl stopped often to rest, and when she stopped for the last time not far from the trench, the fighter breathed a sigh of relief and quietly said, Thank you, sister. Ramen to you. It was a young, shoulder-shouldered Kazakh fighter from a neighboring unit. Courage and bravery of military officer Masha Levikina were recognized with a high government award, the Order of the Red Star. After the war, the former battalion commander and the brave paramedic together sat on the student bench. Nowadays, Maria Vasilievna and Nikolai Alexeyevich Mikhailev's work in Moscow, in the Ministry of Agriculture of the USSR. Military interpreters Olga Grabar and Galina Roshkova did a lot of work in those days. Going to the neutral strip, they often under enemy fire conducted radio programs for German soldiers. Olga Grabar participated in 2 searches of scouts of the 40th Amur Rifle Regiment to capture Tungs, was wounded. Now the courageous frontline soldier lives in Moscow, works at the Institute of Molecular Biology of the USSR Academy of Sciences. Olga Igorevna is a doctor of biological sciences. Kursk battle began on July 5, 1943 at 5 hours 30 minutes. Hitler's armies were striking from the area south of Oral in the direction to Okhovatka and Poniri, on the front up to 40 kilometers against the compounds of the 13th Army and the flanks of the 48th and 70th Armies adjoining to it, that is in the base of the northern front of the Kursk Bulge. Our 70th Army occupied the western part of the northern front of the Arc. At the same time, Hitlerites were striking from the area of Belgorod to the base of the southern front of the Arc in the direction of Oboyan and Korosha. Hitler's commanders intended to cut off the Kursk Bulge, and according to their plans, we were to be surrounded. German fascist troops were advancing to the right of the defense line of our division. During the first days of the Battle of Kursk, Hitlerites made several fire strikes on the positions of the 102nd Infantry Division and conducted reconnaissance by combat. But for all of us it was clear that the day of active fighting and our connection was approaching. As it is known, the Hitlerites' offensive failed. Our troops went on a counter-offensive and it developed successfully. During these days we were in languid, waiting for the order of the commander of the 70th Army, Lieutenant General I. V. Gelenin, about the offensive. On July 27, the order was finally received. The division, defending the 30th Rifle Kasan Regiment stripped Bryancevo, Halzeyevo, 2 regiments, the 16th Usury and 40th Amur Rifle, struck at the villages of Reichavtik and Muravtik in the general direction of Ignativo, almost strictly to the north. During 3 days of fighting the regiments, overcoming strong fire resistance of the enemy and his numerous counterattacks, completely defeated the fortified resistance knot and seized important in tactical terms 3 heights and settlements: Muravchik, Krasnaya Strelitsa, Srednaya Log, Martinovsky Forest. Hitlerites' defense strip stretched from west to east. We began to attack strictly to the north. Having reached the village of Ignativo, the division broke through the German defense to its full depth, and, having turned to the west, began with fights as if to reel it from east to west, advancing to the northeastern outskirts of the town of Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky. Ahead of our units breaking through the long-term enemy defences were communists and Komsomol members. I remember the report of the deputy commander of the political part of the 40th Amur Regiment, dated August 5, 1943, about how the Partuda Battalion's senior Lieutenant Ivan Potapkin during the battle was in the fighting order among the soldiers, by personal example, drawing them forward to help the Partogrogsev companies to draw up documents for those joining the party to organize party political work in the battle. Behind these scanty and seemingly mundane lines, a deep meaning. Political worker was able to find his place in the battle. He not only actively carried out party organizing work on the battlefield, but also by personal example enthused the fighters to fulfill the combat at the right moment to be ahead, to become the soul of the military collective. There was a battle for Krasnaya Strelitsa. The platoon of Komsomol Lieutenant Stadnishenko was stopped by strong fire from the southern outskirts of the village. To advance further, to lose men. The young lieutenant was a little confused, but here in the combat order of the platoon, next to the lieutenant appeared the partorg of the battalion, Senior Lieutenant Potapkin. The very appearance of the partorg, the leader of the battalion communists, cheered up both the platoon commander and his men. Having assessed the situation and understood the state of Lieutenant Stadnishenko, the partorg, by the way, as if thinking aloud, said, "And if we try on the right, go around, run over to the garden." The lieutenant himself had thought of such an idea, but he refused it. In the garden, he thought, just a lot of Germans because behind the trees you can safely hide, but the garden was located on the northeast side of the village, not along the defence front to the south. That's what the lieutenant did not take into account. Stadnikenko sends 2 fighters. They crawl to the garden, find out everything. In the garden, only firing positions of mortars. In mortar calculations on 5-6 Hitlerites. Lieutenant Stadnichenko's platoon, using the folds of the terrain, secretly concentrates near the garden. Then a throw, the calculations are destroyed or captured. Mortars become trophies. Partor Potapkin advised to strike quickly from the trophy mortars on Hitlerites' positions, located in the southern part of the village Krasnaya Strelitsa. Lieutenant Stadnishenko did so. The dazed Germans instantly got away from the village. Krasnaya Strelitsa was cleared of the enemy. When the battalion fought for the village of Ignativo, which was the last knot of resistance to the enemy in the depths of his defence, the first to the outskirts of the settlement leaked Sergeant Kryushkin's department. Zapata wrote about it on a sheet from a notebook and passed it along the chain. Soldiers of other departments began to leak more bravely after the sergeant. Hitlerites rose in a counterattack. Manual machine gunner Communist Pentyukov led them to 30-25 meters and opened a devastating fire, destroying more than 20 enemy soldiers. Potapkin wrote about it on a sheet of paper and passed it along the chain. Other machine gunners also began to show more restraint, let the Germans in and destroyed them from short distances. Reports on the chain about the feats of the best soldiers gave new strength to the advancing fighters, helped them to defeat the enemy and take Ignativo during the battles for the height of 259.4, covering the village of Afanasyevskoye. The battalion's advance was hindered by a machine gunner and an enemy machine gunner who were in a tank that had been hit. The battalion commander, Communist Major Makachev, stopped the battalion. It was necessary to suppress the firing points to avoid unnecessary losses. Who to send? Sergeant Komisarenko and Red Army man Vaishin, the deputy commander on the political part of the senior Lieutenant Grishin. Everyone in the battalion lovingly called Kosarenko just Kostya. Most of the soldiers respected him for his cheerful disposition, youth and desperate Komsomol dash. They also knew him from the border guard unit. There, in the Far East, he was a Komsomol leader in one of the units. Together with Komisarenko and Vaishin crawled and party leader Potapkin. Mukashev and Grishin looked at each other. It seems that they could have done without him, but if he went it would be more reliable. The minutes of waiting dragged on painfully, but then, one after another, several grenades exploded. The battalion went forward, and not a single shot was heard from the tank. I remember well Senior Lieutenant Ivan Potapkin, a short, thin, frail-looking officer. But he was a real party leader, a communist with a capital letter, unusually modest, never raising his voice at anyone. He enjoyed the deepest respect of all the personnel, not only of the battalion, but of the entire regiment. What a regiment! He was known and loved by many in the division. He was an amazingly charming man and even a poet, refuting the thesis that when the guns are rattling, the muses are silent. Ivan Potapkin, in the moments of lull, had time to write in the division newspaper not only articles in which he generously shared with everyone the experience of party political work of his own and supported, but also poems. Of course, he was not a professional poet, but in his sincere poems he strove to convey to his comrades in arms a great feeling of love for the motherland, the joy of victory. In the first days of the offensive, we were once again convinced how cunning and ruthless the enemy is. We were convinced that he was ready to influence our fighters by any means, just to get the information he needed. On August 3, 1943, Komsomolets Junior Lieutenant Boris Simonov, who headed a rifle platoon of the 16th Ussuri Regiment, was given the task to occupy the height of 254.8, covering the approaches to the village of Alexandrovskoye, and to hold it until the approach of the main forces. Lieutenant Zatyupa, the battalion commissar, also went into battle for the height with Simonov's platoon. By skillful maneuver, the platoon knocked out the enemy from the trench and occupied the height. Hitlerites, realizing the importance of it, decided to restore the position at any cost. On a handful of fighters unleashed a barrage of artillery and mortar fire. During the night, the fascists counterattacked the height 7 times. All the ground here was ploughed over by artillery fire. The platoon held on. By dawn on August 4, only Lieutenant Zatyupa, Junior Lieutenant Boris Simonov, and Komsomol Sergeant Konstantin Igorov remained alive, but they were also wounded. When it dawned, Hitlerites undertook the 8th counterattack. The defenders of the height continued the fight, but soon it became quiet at the height. When the next day the battalion knocked out the Nazis from the height, there were found 3 burnt corpses. It was difficult to identify Junior Lieutenant Simonov, Lieutenant Zatyupa, and Sergeant Igorov. It was established by the Special Commission. All 3, seriously wounded, unconscious. Hitlerites captured them. They brought them to their senses and tried to get information about our troops. Soviet soldiers were silent. Then the enraged fascist freaks began to torture them. To Simonov and Zatyupa, Hitlerites cut off ears, then gouged out eyes. The heroes were silent. The fascists began to take Igorov. He refused to speak. They put a belt noose around his neck and dragged him along the trench and strangled him. After that, the executioners again took up Simonov and Zatyupa. They were silent. Hitlerites poured gasoline on all 3 and burned them. In any situation, no matter how difficult and heavy it was, the communists and Komsomol members remained faithful to military duty and oath. In the offensive strip of the division, there were many settlements and a lot of all sorts of heights and towers. Hitlerites in advance turned each village into nodes of defense, using houses and barns. Each height is 1 or sometimes 2 pillboxes and numerous firing points. And here behind the village Muravchik, which remained in the memory of all fighters, commanders and political workers of the division for a long time, the infamous height 260.2 appeared. In front of the height once grew rye. It survived somewhere. But the strip of this half-knocked-out rye ended 200 meters before the height. You can't pass, you can't crawl unnoticed. Hitlerites shot here literally every centimeter, and the day was already running out. Komsor Kostya Komisarenko came to combat Mukasha. Comrade Major, allow me with the Komsomol members to knock out the Germans from the heights. How will you do it? The terrain in front of the height is as clean as a table. With the onset of darkness, they keep lighting it with rockets. It won't work. The Komsomol will do it, Comrade Major, persuaded Komisarenko. The Komsomol leader, with a small group of fighters through Martinovsky Forest at night, will go to the rear of Hitlerites, unexpectedly attack. Taking advantage of the attack from the rear, the battalion should break into the heights. We agreed on the signals. Daredevils under the command of Senior Sergeant Konstantin Komisarenko passed for the night 8 kilometers through the forest and crawled to the height with a kilometer. By dawn, they were in the rear of the Germans, at the foot of the height. The Komsomol members rushed into the trench of the Hitlerites, destroyed 3 heavy machine guns. The fascists started a terrible panic. And then the battalion fighters went in attack from the front. The height was taken. During the battles near Dmitrovsk-Solovsky, Senior Sergeant Komisarenko several times collected on the battlefield the soldiers who were left without commanders, formed groups of them, and led them into battle. He replaced, when necessary, the dead commanders of the platoon and even the company. Konstantin Ignatiev failed to reach the town of Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky. He died a hero's death on its outskirts. The personnel of the 1st Battalion was inspired and carried into battle by the commander himself, the communist Major Mukachev. It was a man of exceptional courage, tireless organizer, strong-willed officer. Awarded the Order of the Red Banner for battles in defense. In the offensive he fought selflessly, showing great tactical skill. The 40th Amur Rifle Regiment was advancing on the right flank of the division. The battalion under the command of Major Mukachev was the first to enter the village of Ignatievo. Its neighbours, on the right the 3rd Battalion, and on the left the 2nd, did not lag behind. But their companies, advancing elbow to elbow with Mukachev's battalion, were left without commanders. Mukachev subordinated them to himself, directed these units into battle where it was possible to achieve the greatest success. Having broken the resistance of the enemy at any height or settlement, he quickly went to the Germans on the flanks, forced them to roll back. The enemy was afraid of the coverage from the flanks, and smelling the possibility of encirclement, hastily withdrew. Major Mukachev was the first among the combatants to be awarded the Order of Lenin on behalf of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR for the liberation of Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky. Many warm words could be said to the address of the head of the political department of the division, Colonel Konstantin Vasilievich Ovchinnikov. Small stature, with a large head, crowned with a mop of curly black hair, cut through a strand of grey hair, with a simple Russian face, illuminated by lively eyes, Konstantin Vasilievich knew how to dispose people to himself, to be their true comrade, and during the battles he was always on the front line, where it was more difficult. The chief of the political department was always distinguished by excellent knowledge of the situation, the ability to understand it, to find the most correct decision for the battle, the style of his work, the education of a particular person, a platoon or squad commander, observer, gunner, machine gunner, medic, cook. Such was the style of work of all the workers of the political department, officers Korobov, Selivanyov, Rukavishnikov, Elkin, and others. Konstantin Vasilievich Ovchinnikov came to us in the division in the first days of its formation, having a huge life experience. Having started his service in the border troops as a Red Army soldier, he advanced to a political officer of a large scale. Sibnikov demanded from every worker of political bodies and party organizations in every private, sergeant officer to look for a grain of good, positive, and develop it, to put everything at the service of our main goal of those days, the defeat of the enemy. This painstaking, constant work contributed to the formation of the division personnel perseverance. Persistence in ensuring the fulfillment of combat tasks gave it. After the liberation of the village Ignatievo, having assessed the situation, on August 5 I put into action the 30th Rifle Kazan Regiment with the task from Halzevo 2 battalions to strike in the direction of the height of 267.7 and the villages of Uspensky and Vozdvizhinsky. During the day the order was carried out. The enemy repeatedly went into counterattacks, but all his efforts were broken by the stubborn defense of the forward battalion of Major Gorev, skillfully and competently led the battle. Being at the regiment's regimental post, I witnessed such a combat episode. During the next enemy fire attack, the telephone connection of one of the battalions with the regiment was out of order. Ivan Shaptorov, a Red Army soldier, went out to repair the broken cable. He was wounded in the leg and back, but found and fixed the damage. The communicator did not go to the infirmary. He asked for medical help on the spot. Soon the communication was broken again. Shaptorov crawled along the line, found a break, and restored communication. Only after that the brave communicator was sent to the infirmary, where a few days later he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his feat. On August 12, 1943, at 2 o'clock in the morning, by a sudden and simultaneous blow from the east and northeast parts of the division, interacting with parts of the 18th Rifle Corps, storming the city from the southern and southwestern outskirts, broke into Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky, and by dawn completely cleared it of Hitler's invaders. It was the first city in the liberation of which our division took part. It is clear such a fact itself meant a lot for all the personnel of the division, but the heavy battles for the liberation of the city, in a special way memorable to me not only for this reason. They are remembered by indomitable offensive impulse of fighters, commanders, and political workers. These battles for all of us, starting from the officers of the headquarters and political department, ending with every Red Army soldier, were a serious school of field combat, breaking into the enemy's defense, densely packed with firepower and long-term fortifications. Our units and subdivisions learned the tactical art of bypassing them, blocking, and when the situation required it, and storm from the rear in small groups. Acting directly in the fighting order, the artilleryman mastered the difficult art of supporting the infantry with fire and wheels. Staff officers learned to quickly bring combat tasks to the unit, and most importantly, General Army and Artillery Chiefs began to better solve the issues of interaction. Soon after the liberation of Dmitrovskolovsky, the 102nd Far Eastern Rifle Division was withdrawn from the 70th Army and reassigned to the 48th Army by order of the commander of the Central Front. On August 22, 1943, it was transferred to the area of Pochinok-Olshok in the Orel region. In the last days of August 1943, the troops of the Central Front continued to successfully advance in the southwestern direction. Ahead were the rivers Desna, Soch, Steinlipa, which were to be forced. Our division received a new combat task. I was ordered to receive it at the Army headquarters. Having given a preliminary order to the division units in accordance with the received instructions of the Central Front headquarters to continue the offensive in the southwestern direction, I, with the head of the division political department, Colonel Ovchinnikov, left at night to the village marked on the map. Almost all night we had to look for the Army headquarters. We found it at dawn. We were immediately received by General Nikolai Alexandrovich Isterman, a member of the Military Council of the Army. Nikolai Alexandrovich, of medium height, about 45 years old, round-faced, received us cordially. The conversation took place in a relaxed atmosphere over a glass of tea. The general asked in great detail about the needs of the division, about the experience gained in the battles, about the personnel. We reported that platoons and companies were commanded by cadre commanders with 5 years of service in officer positions, who had graduated from military schools and had combat experience. During the conversation, a member of the Military Council said that the Supreme Command Headquarters attaches special importance to forcing the Desna River on the move in a short time. The commander of the 48th Army, Lieutenant General P. L. Romanenko, entrusted the fulfillment of this task in the first place to the 102nd Far Eastern Rifle Division. It is necessary after the decision to put the task to the units to force, to plan the forcing, to make crossing means and solve many other issues. At the end of the conversation, a member of the Military Council promised to visit the division in the coming days to get acquainted with the soldiers, commanders, and political workers. More specific instructions were received by us at the Army headquarters. We left there in a good mood, thinking about how to better fulfill the main task, to force the Desna River from the start. From August 26 to August 31, 1943, the division fought here to break through Hitler's defense, the depth of which was about 10 kilometers. In these battles, border guards had to deal with numerous tanks and self-propelled artillery installations of the enemy. The first meetings of our fighters with enemy tanks occurred on the outskirts of Dmitrovskolovsky. After the 16th Ushariysk Rifle Regiment occupied the village of Alexandrovskoy, Hitlerites went into counterattack, supported by tanks. Our fighters were armed with grenades and anti-tank guns. One of the German tanks went straight to the trenches of Sergeant Ilya Pertsov's department. The soldiers froze. They had not yet had to meet with tanks. Sergeant Ilya Pertsov was not confused, gave the command to prepare to open fire on the enemy infantry running after the tank. He himself lay down behind the anti-tank gun and waited for the tank to put up the side. Pertsov knew to hit the frontal armor. When the tank began to turn to the left, the sergeant opened fire, aiming at the tank's wingmen and support wheels. Pertsov knew that behind them were gas tanks. Simultaneously with Pertsov, the squad's gunners opened fire, aiming at the observation and sub-tower slits, hoping to blind the tank or jam the turret. The tank turned its turret and opened fire on Pertsov's trench. The first shell flew past and exploded behind the trench. Ilya Pertsov was more accurate. He had time to make 3 shots, and it is difficult to say which of them was the most accurate, but it doesn't matter. More important is another thing. The tank suddenly burst into flames. Its turret hatch opened and Hitlerites began to jump to the ground. Immediately they fell under the bullets of our riflemen. Pertsov's success became known to all personnel of the division. After him, the armoured gunners of Lieutenant Melnik's unit burned several tanks with the same success, and the lieutenant himself shot down 1 tank from the rifle. Our artillery also played a big role in the fight with tanks. For example, in the first days of August, Senior Sergeant Pavel Sinitsin's gun crew shot down an enemy self-propelled gun of Ferdinand type. In the battles on the approaches to the Desna, the Nazis had a lot of tanks. The fight with them was often dramatic. So, at the end of August, when the breakthrough of the Hitlerites' defense was nearing the end, the units of the 16th Infantry Regiment approached a large village. Intelligence available to the command of the unit indicated a strong defense around the village. It was impossible to take the village on the move. Our units began to quickly entrench. Artillerymen vigorously began to equip firing positions. On the next day, the battery, which included the calculation of Pavel Sinitsin, was attacked by German tanks. In total, 8 of them were advancing on the battery. The battery prepared for battle. Artillerists patiently waited for the approach of tanks, having decided to hit for sure. Hitlerites did not fire from cannons either, but only occasionally hit from machine guns at places that seemed suspicious to them. Finally, they approached at 350-400 meters. The long-awaited command sound. On the Nazi tanks, fire. Shots rang out. In turn, the tanks, continuing their slow march forward, opened aimed cannon and machine gun fire on the firing positions of our artillerymen. From the smoke of bursts and clouds of dust rose up 2 vehicles, which clearly intended to rupt the firing position of the calculation of Senior Sergeant Sin. The artillerymen worked perfectly. One of the tanks was enveloped in a cloud of smoke. It caught fire, followed by the second tank shuddered and stopped. Then the third tank was hit. Hitlerites rolled back. There was a pause. We could take a break. But the fascists bypassed the firing positions of artillerymen through the forest and tried to surround them. They appeared from the flanks and from the rear. The artillerymen took a circular defense. Enemy soldiers, despite the heavy fire of our fighters from machine guns and rifles, came closer and closer to the firing positions. Then Senior Sergeant Sinitsin ordered to roll out the gun on direct aiming. Gunner Sergeant Malishev fell to the site, and they opened fire. Shell after shell was sent to the enemy by Sinitsin. The ranks of the attackers were thinning, but they persistently continued to advance. Malishev and second number Kashtanov were wounded. Sinitsin himself was wounded, but the artillerymen continued to fire. Finally, the Germans rolled back, but soon again appeared tanks. Now they were even more cautious, but Sinitsin was extremely cautious. He decided to hit only for sure, and as soon as the German tank appeared in the sight, a shot rang out. The fighting machines stopped. There was one such moment that day, when Hitlerites found themselves a few meters away from Sinitsin's gun, preparing to capture it. But Senior Sergeant Sinitsin, Lieutenant Commander Setnishenko, Sergeant Leonid Pushkin managed to roll the gun from under the noses of the fascists and, having unexpectedly struck them, destroyed the attackers, and then again returned to their firing position and continued the battle. Other calculations also struck in a friendly manner. The enemy was stopped. That day, from 4.0 to 21.0, Hitlerites 6 times made attacks. Twice tried to encircle our units, but they did not succeed. Our soldiers had already learned a lot. They were no longer afraid of encirclement. They had the experience of battles near Dmitrovsk-Orlovsky. In the middle of the day, to the artillerymen came reinforcements. Fighting became more fun.